Hey everyone, welcome to our introductory video for how to actually animate in Maya. Now this is going to get us through how to create keyframes, how to be able to scale those keyframes, change the amount of frames that we're viewing, play blast, and also be able to do some hotkeys for setting keyframes and all that fun stuff. So what we're going to do first in this is actually reference in our ball. And so for this ball bounce, I am providing for you guys a ball. It's the ultimate ball rig. If we go to the create reference right under file, I have that right on my desktop. So if I find that, it should be, I know I'm super organized right here, ultimate ball, and I'm going to open that up, hit OK or continue, and I have my ball rig. Now this ball rig, if I open up the outliner and open up what I'm actually looking at, you can see that there is a couple different things going on here. This is the first time you probably would see a object that's organized like this. This is grouped with a number of controls and an actual object that is connected in here. So rigs can get quite complicated, even for something this simple of just being a ball bounce. And this is something that will gradually evolve throughout the course and also throughout your time at MVCC for animation projects that you'll be working on. The rigs will become more and more complex. Right now we're just making a ball, but imagine this if this were a character. You'd have a lot more items to be looking at. So if we look at what those items are, one of those things you can notice are these objects, these little circles around our sphere. These are controls, and this control will allow, and you'll notice it's stated as main, allow me to actually move that thing around. I also have this top control, allows me to squash and stretch, and I also have the bottom that allows me to do the same thing. And then I have this one right here. Now I've already seen something like this with the white mage. That was the root control or the master control, and that basically allows for me to be able to grab an object and move it around in a scene or position it into a certain space before I start to animate. Okay, so now that I have this ball, I can start to think about how I'm going to animate it. And for this is going to be a stylized ball bounce, and it's going to continue in loop. That's the goal of this animation. If we look at our timeline at the bottom, it's saying that it is showing me 120 frames and that it is a 200 frame animation. You can also see that if we look at the frames per second, this is actually animating at 24 frames per second. We're going to keep that there. You'll see that my animation is going to start at frame 1, and the start time of the playback range is going to be at frame 1 as well. Now, what does that mean? That means that we can actually zoom in and out of different areas of an animation to be able to view that and modify it. If I take this slider and move it over, you'll notice that that changed. So now it's going from 80 to 199. And the reason why is this allows for us to be able to get more zoomed in or zoomed out of animations. If we want to see all 200 frames of this animation, we can zoom out. Now, what if we don't want to have 200 frames for our animation? Well, we can just change this. So maybe I'm only going to want 24 frames for this. So that would actually give me 1 second, right? So frames per second, that's 24. So that's 1 second. And it's going to start at frame 1 and go to 24. So that's an easy way to be able to change how long the animation is and the amount that's viewable. So if I change that to 5, I still have 24 frames for my animation, but all I'm seeing right now is 5. So I'm going to change that back to 24. Okay. One important thing to realize when we're animating is that there is two different ways, or actually 3 different ways, that playback speeds are being represented in Maya. One of those is real time. Another one is play every frame, and play every frame max real time. Real time is what you should be using right now. These other ones will cause the animation to move way too fast. So that is something that we do not want to see. We want to see real time. So make sure when we right click on our playback button, we have real time on. Okay. So if we were to start working with this file, remember we referenced this in. This was not just opening up the Maya file, you're referencing this in. I'm going to make sure that this is something you did for grading. If I look at my reference editor, so I created a reference, which is the ball. If I open the reference editor, you'll notice it shows me this, and there's this little checkbox. I can hide or show those references, or that rig for that object that I've referenced in, just by checking that box. Now, why would that be important for animation? Well, references are, imagine it as a file that you're placing into another file. And so you're referencing in this file that is a ball. And that means that no matter what you do to this ball in this scene, since you referenced it in, you can't wreck it. Imagine working on a character rig and you have a really, really nice rig. It took a month to build this character, to properly paint out weights, to sculpt it, all that fun stuff, and you're going to start animating it. And then you do something terrible to it. Well, that's not good if you didn't reference in that model file when you started to animate it and you just started animating within that main file. A better way of working is to reference in that final version of the model that you have that's rigged into another file. That way it's going to stay pristine and you're not going to basically be working over that main piece. Another thing that's good about that is you can reference in files and share files with other people that might need a character. So if they have a character that they need to work with, you would reference in a character into that scene, or you can even reference in a set, and maybe the artist that's working on the background, that has to be constantly changed and updated. So you can change the reference to a updated version of that, and the background objects will evolve while you animate the character in the scene. So there's a lot of different reasons for that. We're going to talk more about that in class as well. But it is really important to realize that references are the best way to work when you're making a character that you're going to be animating, or you're doing a lot of different things. This prevents us from screwing up this main rig. Okay, so if we want to animate, first thing I'm going to do is click on this box right here, or this control right here. That's my main. And what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to just move this up in the air. Maybe it's about 8. And I'm going to hit S on the keyboard, and S ends up putting down keyframes for all of my different settings here. So the translate and the rotate on all 3 axes are being added with a keyframe. Now, that is kind of overkill because we only needed to animate on the Y. Everything else is staying the same. So be aware that by hitting the S key, it's going to key everything. Another way to do that is, let's say that if I go to frame 12 now, and I put this down to frame 0, I can right click over this name, and I could just go to key selected. And keying selected now, you'll notice that it's light pink and now red, because this one right here has a keyframe added on 12, whereas everything else does not. It's still saying red, and the reason, or pink, and the reason why that's pink is because it's telling you that this file does have animation applied to that control at some point in the scene. So that's helpful. If it didn't, it would just stay gray. Okay. So now, I've got it up in the air. It's going back down, and I need to get it back up in the air. If I right click, hit copy, right click, hit paste, I now have my object going up and down. Now that doesn't look like a character or anything like that, but it is giving motion to my object. So how do you make it more believable? Well, one of the things we need to realize is that animation doesn't occur just within our timeline and setting keys. One of the other important things that we need to do when we're animating is think about the subtleties of how an object moves. Objects don't move in just really smooth, straightforward paths at the same rate. They either accelerate or they slow down as they move. And so how we can actually get that into our animation is by going into Windows, Animation Editors, and our Graph Editor. Now when I open this up, this is my animation. I can left click drag through that, and I can see that there is this graph that is showing this curve right here, and that is representing just my translate Y. And the translate Y is showing me that this is starting slow, accelerating, and then slowing down. It's slow, accelerating, and then going slow. So slow, fast, slow. That's not exactly how a ball would bounce. A ball would be hanging in the air, and then slow, and then fast, and then it would bounce fast up again. That's not happening right here. We can change that just by, I'm going to open this up a little bit more. I'm going to drag over this, so have that one selected. And I'm going to press this one. That's going to be linear. Watch what happens to my graph editor, or the curve when I change this. Okay, all of a sudden now I have this really sharp angle. And now if we watch the animation, spending more time in the air than it is at the ground. And that is because I've modified the way that the curve is being treated. You might notice there's these little points here, and what those are tangents. And those tangents here, if I were to left click and drag on that, notice I can modify how those are being treated in the graph editor. Now the issue is, right now when I grab one tangent, it modifies the other one. I don't want that to happen. So if I press this button right here, I can break the tangents, and now I can actually left click drag, and now left click drag. And what I'm trying to do is create a more rounded out shape. Think about it, if you threw a ball at the ground, throw it, bounces back up. It's visually how I think about it when how to get these tangents to be lined up. Basically, the ball's going to be hanging in the air. It's fought gravity, it's hanging in the air, and then it's slowly starting to accelerate, hit the ground, bounce back up. So that's what we're trying to recreate with this tangent here. It is a two-dimensional representation of how this motion is being represented in 3D, which I think is a very hard thing for new animators to understand. But once you understand it, it doesn't take too long to get used to it. So just realize that this is how we affect the visual look of how these keyframes represent this motion. So let's see what happens now if I hit play. You can definitely see this is hanging in the air and gradually accelerating, hitting the ground, and bouncing back up. So that's pretty helpful, because we're actually getting a little bit more of a believable portrayal of a ball bounce. Now obviously this isn't a real ball bouncing because it's continuing to bounce. Oh, excuse me. I'm just about to fall asleep. So this ball bounce right here is starting to look good, but it's not stylized, and it's definitely it's looping, which is fine, but it's not realistic in any way. A ball would actually hit the ground and then slowly expend all of its energy and come to rest. For us, we're not doing that. We want this to continuously loop. So the next step to do here is to look at this and start to play with our squash and stretch. So our squash and stretch right now, I have nothing for my squash and stretch. If I were to start to pull up and down on this control, I can change the squash and stretch. When this is up in the air, it's going to maintain that regular shape. So I'm going to actually hit right click and hit key selected. Now, as soon as that hits the ground, let's go to frame 12. That would do the opposite. It would squash. So I'm going to right click, key selected. So now, that's looking a little bit weird. It's not supposed to just flatten out. It should have a stretch. Right now it's squashing. So to put a stretch into here, if you think about it, it's starting to go down, down, down. It should be stretched out the most right before it hits the ground. And to do that, I'm going to go maybe around frame 10. And I'm going to elongate this shape. I'm going to right click, key selected, and now if I hit play, there we go. So now at the start, it's a ball. It's accelerating from a ball shape to sort of this oval, and now it's flattening out as it impacts with the ground. And the next step is, as it comes back up, let's say it around here, I'm going to change that back to a stretch. So I could either key this by hand or go over here, right click, hit copy, go back over to here and hit paste. Now if I want to hit play again, it's going from flattened to stretched again. So squashed to stretched. So that's coming along. Here's a shortcut that we could use to be able to hit play again. Instead of going over here, we can just hit Alt V. And usually, I think my sausage fingers are causing this to not want to work, so that's fun. Hold on one second. I'm not sure why that's not working. Yep, that should just be Alt V. I'm not sure why my playback is not. There we go. It just didn't want to do that one time. There we go. So this is playing back for me. So if we want to hit have that play again, just hit Alt V, and that will play. I had to look it up because I thought I was going crazy. So that is how we can hit play, and then press it again, you'll stop it. So Alt V, not exactly the most comfortable orientation. You have to put your fingers in to get that to work, I find personally, but that is the shortcut and the hotkey to be able to stop and play animation. Okay, so let's say we have this going on. We have this stretching up now, and once it gets to frame 24, we actually don't want this to stay stretched. We want that to go back to a round shape. So we can either do two different things. We can go over to here, grab that top control and zero that out, or we can actually just go back over here, right click, hit copy, and I made a play blast by accident. Let's hit paste, and now let's Alt V. Okay, that's starting to come along. One issue I'm seeing here, and there's actually a couple, but one of the things that I'm starting to see here is that it seems to hang in the air a little bit too long. And the reason why, and this is something that you should realize, if you're going to make a looping animation, if I have frame 1 and frame 24 in here and they're the same, then we're actually seeing that frame for one extra frame longer than we should. So it's giving you a little bit of a hold. I'm going to hit I'm going to go into here and press 23 instead. And now if I hit play, it's a little bit better. Now, I want to kind of stylize this a little bit to make it a little bit better. And one of the things I'd like to do is maybe just have the ball stay in a ball shape for a little bit longer before it starts to go down. So maybe at around frame 4 for me, I'm going to hit 0 and just maintain that look of a ball a little bit longer. Now we're pretty much close to the end of this. I would want 3-point lighting added to this and a floor. So if we add a floor to this, okay. Now what happens if an art director came by, was looking at this and said, you know what, that's looking good, but maybe it's too slow for me. Can you speed that up? Well, yeah, we can. It's actually not a hard thing to do. If I was working from frame 1 to 24 to make this bounce cycle to occur, what I can do is click over here so we have the first frame of this animation selected. So first I'm going to drag across all the controls that I had animated first, so I know that it's just the main control and the top control. And I'm going to hold down shift and left click here and drag all the way across the entire animation. What that just did for me is it allowed for me to grab all the keyframes. Now with that, I can actually go to this middle spot and drag it. That'll move the animation in the timeline, so I can have it start at a different time or stop at a different time. I also, let me just give myself a couple more frames so I can see that. Okay, over here I have an arrow, and you'll see it over there as well if I gave this from frame 0. You can see that arrow there too. This is how we can scale the animation. So I want to start at frame 1, but maybe I don't want it to be that long. Maybe I only want it to go to 14 seconds. Let's see what happens now. Let me put that back to 1, and I'll put that to 14. Then we hit play. So now this animation is occurring in half the amount of time. So that's an easy way that we can modify our timeline, or the keyframes, and by scaling them. Okay, so now that I have that, I can add the 3-point lighting, which, remember, I'm only going to put in 1 for now, but for the assignment, I want 3-point lighting on this. I'm going to add area light, and get this positioned in a way that it can see the ball. And I'm going to go into my attribute editor for it, scale up the intensity, and I'm going to turn the renderer on to Arnold. Okay. Increase the exposure to it and scale that size up too. Okay, let's say, for the sake of just ending this without waiting forever, but that was what I wanted. So how do we render out the animation? Right now it's going from 1 to 24. That's what we animated. But if we want this to loop, what we would want is actually us to have this set up under our render settings to be name, number, extension, and 1 to 23. Now that 23 is because that 24 would be a duplicate of frame 1, so we do not want that. Now that I have that, I can hit close, and if I go into my rendering and my render sequence, I can tell this to go to the proper output path and then hit render sequence. That's after you have your 3-point lighting. So once that's all done, I already have one in the oven, so to speak, and I had already animated this out or rendered that out, sorry. And now I would go into File. So I opened up After Effects, go to New Project, and then right click, go to Import File, open up that first one, so just select that one, make sure Open EXR Sequence is there, hit Import, and now we can drag this in, and if we hit the space bar, we can play that. So how do we actually get this thing rendered out from here if these are all EXRs? Well, remember, we can go into the Adobe Media Encoder queue. We can have that fire up and then render that out as an H.264. So this will take a little bit of time for that to fire up, and while it is, I just want to show one last other idea about how we can look at our animations in Maya. So right now this is my Arnold view. If I turn that off, I'm just hitting that stop button to turn that off, and I wanted to view this animation as this looks like from the viewport, and I wanted this as a movie. Right click and then go to Play Blast, and we can tell the format to change. I'm going to leave AVI for now. I'm going to tell the quality to be to 100, and now display size from window, okay, that's going to render out just that display window, the size of that render. Or we can do from render settings, and so render settings, it's going to render out the Play Blast, which you'll see what that is in a second. That's going to be a quick movie for us. We can tell that to be the render settings that in this case it is HD 540, which is 960 by 540. I'm going to do that. So from render settings. Now, scale. Let's do 100% scale. So 1, and let's hit apply. And this rendered out a Play Blast for me of the animation. Now this is going from frame 1 to frame 24. So if I wanted that to be less, I can do 23. And now if I right clicked and did that again, let me just close that one so I make sure that I don't have that coming up again. Play Blast, there we go. It's adding that additional little frame in there, that flash. So Play Blast, I would never use this to make sure that the loop is correct, because it can give you a little bit of that strangeness there. But it looks like this is actually working pretty well. So there's a lot of different other settings that we can do with Play Blast. For us, I don't want us to have to focus too much on these at the moment, but it is something that is very, very powerful for an animator. If you have a character performance and you don't want to have to sit there and render everything out through Arnold, right-clicking, going into Play Blast, and changing the settings in there so it's a pretty good quality for your art director or your instructor to see, hitting apply, you'll be able to easily see exactly what that motion is rather than seeing the sometimes not so correct view from the viewport. So that is how we Play Blast. Now, I have in my media encoder queue that fired up these files, which I am going to remove all the extra ones from earlier, and I'm going to add the one that I need. So I'm going to go into here and go to my rendered out file. So I have this one. Hopefully that's labeled. Don't do this. I just quickly threw these together so that there's no label in there. I opened that one up. It opened up the sequence as H.264, and if we were to give it a name and give it a home, you'll just click on the output file. I'll put that there. I'll hit save and hit play. It's going to render that out for me, and I should now have on my desktop inside that folder something that for whatever reason stopped. So I stopped the render before it was finished. That's why it's only up to frame 17 and not 24. But this is how we can render those out. So it's not the entire animation, but that's how we can actually get these things output from there. And that's what we'll need is the rendered out movie file and the Maya file for this assignment. And that's pretty much it for just our little intro for animation for this week's exercise.